Tobias Vera grabbed the wooden handle and tugged. The rope became tight, and 16 wooden cages began to slide through the snow toward him, moving like a train through the white darkness. 8 weeks into the blizzard, and the system was still functional. 3 of the cages held rabbits, their eyes bright through the slatted wood, still alive despite 2 days in the storm. For miles to the east, Martin Cole sat in his cabin, staring at 6 dried beans in his palm, all the food he had left, wondering if his strange German neighbor was already frozen somewhere in the endless white. Before we go on, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is just as remarkable. The winter of 1839 to 1840 nearly killed them both. Tobias Vera and his partner Frank Grayson had built their trap lines the way every mountain man did. 50 steel traps scattered along game trails, some as far as 8 miles from their cabin. The method had worked for decades. Trappers walked their circuits every 2 to 3 days, collected pelts, reset traps, and returned home. It was hard work, but reliable. That winter taught Tobias that reliable and safe were not the same thing. The storm hit in late December. Not unusual. Montana winters always brought heavy snow. But this storm lingered. 1 week became 2. 2 became 3. The snow piled higher than the cabin windows. Wind created drifts that swallowed landmarks. Visibility dropped to nothing for days at a time. Frank insisted they wait it out. Every mountain man knew you didn't travel in whiteout conditions. You stayed put, ate your supplies, and waited for the weather to break. By the 3rd week, their food was gone. The dried meat, the beans, the cornmeal, everything they had stored was consumed. Frank remained confident. The storm would end soon. It always did. They could survive a few more days without food. Hunger was temporary. Freezing to death was permanent. Tobias agreed, but he kept thinking about their trap lines. 50 traps positioned along 8 miles of territory. Some would have catches, fresh meat waiting, impossible to reach. The 4th week broke them. Hunger became pain. Pain became weakness. Weakness became desperation. They had to try. They left the cabin on a morning when the wind dropped slightly, following the frozen creek bed toward their nearest trap line. They made it 2 miles before the whiteout returned. Frank wanted to continue. Tobias refused. They could barely see 10 feet ahead, lose the creek, and they would never find the cabin again. They turned back, exhausted and empty-handed. That night, lying in the dark cabin, too weak to maintain a proper fire, Tobias understood something Frank did not. The problem was not bad luck. The problem was not the storm's unusual duration. The problem was structural. Their survival system depended on traveling long distances in all weather conditions. When weather made travel impossible, the system failed completely. They had food within reach. Trapped animals waiting in cages 8 miles away, but it might as well have been 800 miles. Distance killed you just as surely as cold. The storm finally ended in early January. They survived by emergency hunting. Tobias shot a winter-thin deer near the cabin on the first clear day. They processed the meat with shaking hands, eating half-cooked venison before it was properly prepared. Frank called it bad luck, an unusually long storm, nothing more. He went back to setting his trap lines the traditional way as soon as the snow settled. Tobias said nothing, but he could not stop thinking about the structural problem. Distant traps were useless during extended storms. The solution seemed impossible. How could you trap animals without traveling to where the animals were? The question consumed him. Spring came to the Montana high country in late March 1840. Tobias and Frank sold their winter's pelts at Fort McKenzie, a modest profit after the near starvation had cost them 6 weeks of prime trapping. Frank decided to move his operation south to the Musselshell River, where another trapper reported better beaver populations. He asked Tobias to partner again the following season. Tobias said he would consider it. They both knew he was declining politely. Frank left in early April. Tobias returned to his cabin alone. Most trappers spent their summers scouting new territory, socializing at trading posts, or traveling to St. Louis to spend their earnings. Tobias spent his summer thinking about trap lines. He could not articulate the solution yet, but he understood the parameters. Any system that required traveling miles in severe weather was fundamentally vulnerable. The trap line had to come to him, not the other way around. But animals followed their own trails, their own patterns. You could not simply move the wilderness closer to your cabin. Unless you could. Tobias began observing game movement near his cabin rather than miles away. He spent mornings sitting motionless on a hillside, watching rabbits moved through the same areas repeatedly. Marmots had consistent territories. Even deer followed predictable paths to water sources. The game was not evenly distributed across the entire wilderness. It concentrated in specific locations based on food, water, and shelter. Traditional trap lines went to distant territories because that was where trappers believed the best hunting existed. But adequate hunting existed everywhere. The question was not where to find animals, but how to trap them without traveling. By midsummer, Tobias had covered the walls of his cabin with charcoal sketches, trap designs, connection systems, distance calculations. He drew wooden box traps instead of steel leg hold traps. Box traps could keep animals alive. Live animals did not spoil. Live animals could wait. He sketched rope systems connecting multiple traps. Pull the rope, bring the traps to you. It seemed absurd, but the mathematics worked. 16 traps spaced 10 feet apart created a line 160 feet long. He could see 160 feet from his cabin door, even in heavy snow. 5 lines radiating outward like wheel spokes gave him 80 trap positions within safe distance. In August, Tobias traveled to Fort Mackenzie to purchase supplies. Henry Blackwood operated the trading post, a gruff former Hudson's Bay Company factor who had seen everything the frontier could offer. Tobias placed his order: 200 feet of hemp rope, 40 pounds of iron nails, 6 sheets of canvas, and materials for building wooden cages. Henry raised an eyebrow. You building a fort or trapping beaver? Tobias replied that he was improving his trapline efficiency. Henry shrugged and filled the order. Money was money. If the strange German wanted to waste his summer building something, that was his business. Tobias also purchased 2 books. One was a carpentry manual showing joinery techniques. The other was a trapping guide that included cage trap designs for live capture. He spent his evenings reading by candlelight, teaching himself principles his father had never covered. Jakob Werner had been a master cabinet maker in Bavaria, and Tobias had learned basic woodworking as a boy. But his father had built furniture, not survival equipment. The requirements were different. A cabinet that failed meant a dissatisfied customer. A trap system that failed meant death. Tobias read the sections on joint strength 3 times, memorizing load calculations and wood selection criteria. September arrived. Most trappers were beginning their fall trapping, taking advantage of animals fattening for winter. Tobias did not set a single trap. Instead, he began building. Tobias cut his first logs in early September. He selected young pines approximately 4 inches in diameter, thick enough for structural strength, thin enough to split into planks with wedges and a maul. Each tree had to meet specific criteria: straight grain, minimal knots, uniform thickness. He rejected 3 trees for every one he cut. Other trappers would have used whatever was convenient. Tobias remembered his father's voice. The wood you choose determines the joint you can make. He stripped bark and split logs into planks roughly 1 inch thick. The work was monotonous and physically exhausting. Each plank required careful splitting to maintain consistent thickness. Uneven planks created weak joints. Weak joints meant failed traps. He worked from dawn until his hands cramped, then spent evenings smoothing planks with a draw knife. By September's end, he had lumber for 30 traps. He needed 84 total, 16 traps for each of 5 radial lines plus 4 spares. Trap construction followed a pattern he refined through trial and error. Each cage measured 12 inches wide, 18 inches long, and 10 inches high. He cut vertical slats from planks, spacing them 1 inch apart. Too wide, and small game escaped. Too narrow, and traps became too heavy. He assembled frames using mortise and tenon joints at corners, drilling holes with a hand auger and fitting wooden pegs. No nails in frames. Nails worked loose over time. The door mechanism took longest to perfect. He designed a gravity drop door that hung open until an animal disturbed a trigger plate. The plate was thin wood balanced on a pivot point. When weight pressed the interior end, the exterior end lifted, releasing a catch holding the door. The door dropped instantly. He built 7 prototypes before achieving reliable triggering without false releases from wind or snow. By late October, other trappers noticed. Martin Cole stopped by checking beaver dams. He found Tobias assembling Trap 46 surrounded by completed cages. Martin stared. "You planning to trap the entire territory?" Tobias explained. "Connected traps on rope lines all reachable from the cabin." Martin listened politely, but clearly thought his neighbor had spent too much time alone. "The animals are out there, not here," he said, gesturing toward distant mountains. Red Murphy's visit was less polite. Murphy was 47 and had survived 25 winters using traditional methods. He arrived with 2 younger trappers, drawn by rumors of the German building 100 wooden cages instead of trapping. Murphy examined the traps and laughed. "You wasted the entire autumn building these? While we've been taking pelts, you've been playing carpenter." The younger trappers joined his laughter. "Animals run trap lines because we put traps where animals go. You think rabbits will walk to your cabin because you built fancy boxes?" November brought the first serious snow. Tobias finished his 84th trap and began deployment. He had treated all the rope with rendered bear fat, waterproofing it and preventing freeze brittleness. Each line extended from his cabin in different compass directions. He positioned traps at 10-foot intervals, threading the rope through iron eyelet rings mounted on each cage. At each line's end, he drove stakes deep into the frozen ground. Deployment took 4 days. He baited the traps with dried apple and set the triggers. Within 2 days, 3 rabbits. The system worked. He pulled the north line, brought 16 traps to his door, removed the catches, reset the triggers, redeployed. Martin stopped by mid-November. Tobias showed him the rabbits. Martin admitted it was clever, but remained skeptical. "I've got 50 traps covering 8 miles. Neither man knew the storm was 6 days away. The blizzard began on November 22, 1840. Tobias woke to wind, rattling his cabin door, and snow falling in thick curtains that obscured everything beyond 20 feet. He had seen hundreds of storms during his 8 years in the mountains. This one felt different. The air pressure had dropped dramatically overnight. His ears popped when he stood. The wind came from the northwest, steady and cold, carrying moisture that promised days of heavy snowfall. He dressed in layers, pulled on his heaviest coat, and stepped outside to check his trap lines. The north line was easiest to reach. He gripped the wooden handle he had carved specifically for this purpose, 6 inches long, smooth from oil treatment, fitted with a loop of rope. He pulled. The rope went taut. 16 traps began sliding through fresh snow toward him. 2 held rabbits. He processed them quickly, reset the triggers, and walked the line back out to its full extension. The entire operation took 40 minutes. He repeated the process with the northeast line, 1 rabbit, then the east line, 2 more rabbits, 5 animals total before noon. Enough food for 3 days. By afternoon, visibility dropped to 10 feet. Snow accumulated faster than Tobias had ever seen. He measured 6 inches of new snow in 4 hours. Wind created drifts against the north wall of his cabin that reached past the window. He brought in extra firewood and secured his door. The storm was settling in for the duration. He had seen this pattern once before, the failed winter that nearly killed him and Frank. Low pressure, steady wind, continuous snowfall. The difference was his trap lines. Last time he had starved, waiting for the weather to clear. This time his food supply was 160 feet away, connected by rope he could follow blind if necessary. For miles east, Martin Cole watched the same storm and made different calculations. He had checked his trap lines 2 days earlier and caught 7 beavers, good pelts that would bring premium prices. But his traps were scattered across 8 miles of territory. The nearest was 2 miles from his cabin. The farthest was 6. He had food stores for 3 weeks, maybe 4, if he rationed carefully. Normal storms lasted 5 to 7 days. He could wait this out easily. He banked his fire and settled in. Red Murphy, 10 miles north, was caught away from his cabin when the storm intensified. He had been checking his western trap line when visibility collapsed. He made it back, but the journey took 3 hours instead of 1. He arrived exhausted and frozen. Inside his cabin, warming by the fire, he decided he would not risk another trip until the weather cleared. His food stores were adequate. Patience kept you alive in the mountains, not rushing around in blizzards. The first week passed. Snow continued without break. Tobias checked his trap lines every 3 days, pulling each line to his door, processing catches, redeploying. His system worked exactly as designed. Other trappers waited. The storm showed no signs of ending. Week 4 began, with no change in weather. Snow fell continuously. Wind remained steady from the northwest. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees. Tobias marked the days on his cabin wall with charcoal, 28 lines now grouped in sets of 7. He had never seen a storm last this long. Neither had anyone else in the territory. Martin Cole's food supplies were running dangerously low. He had rationed carefully, eating half portions for 2 weeks, but mathematics were absolute. He had maybe 5 days of food remaining. The storm gave no indication of ending. He faced the choice every trapper dreaded: starve waiting or risk travel. On day 29, he decided to wait. 5 more days. Surely the weather would break. Red Murphy made a different choice. On day 26, he left his cabin to check his trap lines. He knew where they were. He had run those lines for 3 years. Even in poor visibility, he could navigate by landmarks: the split pine, the creek bend, the rock outcropping. He told himself he would travel carefully, turn back if conditions worsened. He needed food. Waiting meant certain starvation. Action gave him a chance. Murphy made it 1 mile before losing his bearings. The split pine was invisible in the whiteout. The creek was buried under 4 feet of snow. The rock outcropping could have been anywhere. He continued forward, believing his trap line was just ahead. It was not. He was walking parallel to his intended route, moving farther from his cabin with each step. When he finally realized his mistake, he tried to backtrack. The wind had filled his tracks within minutes. He had no reference points. He chose a direction and walked, hoping to intersect something familiar. Frank Grayson, trapping the Muscle-Shell River Territory 60 miles south, made his attempt on day 30. His food had run out 3 days earlier. He was weak from hunger, but still capable of travel. He knew his trap lines perfectly. 10 years of experience told him he could navigate even in bad conditions. He left at dawn, following the river. The river was a certainty. Follow it downstream, and he would reach his traps. But rivers look identical when buried in snow. He followed what he thought was the main channel. It was a tributary. He realized his error after 2 miles. Turning back, he could not find his original path. Peter Lundgren panicked on day 32. He was 22 years old in his first season trapping alone. His food was gone. He decided to reach Fort McKenzie, 40 miles east. If he could make it to the trading post, he would survive. He left his cabin carrying minimal supplies, trying to move fast. He made it half a mile. Exhaustion and cold overcame him. He sat down to rest and did not get up. Tobias pulled his trap lines on day 30. 12 catches total, 6 rabbits, 4 marmots, 2 snowshoe hares. He processed the meat, preserved what he could not eat immediately, and redeployed his lines. The system continued working. Week 7 arrived with no change in conditions. Tobias marked day 49 on his cabin wall. The charcoal lines covered an entire log, now grouped in sets of 7. 7 completes 7 groups. He had stopped expecting the storm to end. Instead, he focused on routine. Routine kept you sane when the world outside became incomprehensible. Every 3rd day, he checked his trap lines. The process had become meditative. Wake before dawn. Dress in layers. Step outside into the white. Grip the wooden handle. Pull the north line. Count the traps as they arrived. 1, 2, 3. Continuing to 16. Check each cage. Remove catches. Reset triggers. Walk the line back out, paying rope through his hands, counting again to ensure full deployment. Repeat with the northeast line, then east, then southeast, then south. 5 lines, 80 traps total. Checked in 4 hours. The catches varied, but never stopped completely. Some days brought 2 animals, some days brought 8. The average was 4 to 5 per check cycle, enough to sustain him with surplus for preservation. He smoked meat over his fire, creating reserves. His food stores grew instead of diminishing. The system worked because it was based on statistics rather than luck. 80 trap positions created mathematical certainty. Even low success rates produced adequate results. The psychological challenge was greater than the physical. Tobias spent 23 hours of every check day inside his cabin alone, listening to the wind. On non-check days, he remained inside entirely. No human contact, no variation in environment, just firelight, wind sounds, and his own thoughts. He carved wood to occupy his hands. He recited German poetry his mother had taught him. He performed mathematical calculations in his head: trap spacing, success rates, caloric values, days of food remaining. He thought about the other trappers frequently. Martin Cole 4 miles east. Was he still alive? Red Murphy 10 miles north. Frank Grayson somewhere south. Peter Lundgren, the young Swede who had visited in October. The storm had likely killed some of them. Tobias felt no satisfaction in that possibility. He had not built his system to prove superiority. He had built it to avoid starvation. If others died, it was tragedy, not vindication. On day 56, during a trapline check, Tobias experienced complete whiteout conditions. Visibility dropped to 0. He could not see his own hands. He stood motionless, gripping the rope, and realized he could navigate by touch alone. The rope was his lifeline. Follow it outward. Count the traps. Follow it back. He completed the check without seeing anything. The system worked even in impossible conditions. For miles away, Martin Cole ate his last 6 beans on day 58. He chewed slowly, making them last. Afterward, he sat by his fire and calculated. He had perhaps 3 days before weakness prevented action. After that, he would die in his cabin. He tried not to think about his German neighbor. Tobias was certainly dead by now. Everyone was dead. The storm had killed the entire territory. Martin closed his eyes and waited. Day 77 marked a grim milestone. Tobias carved the 11th group of 7 lines on his cabin wall. 11 weeks, 77 days of continuous storm. He searched his memory for any historical reference to weather lasting this long. Nothing. Older trappers had told stories of bad winters, extended storms, seasons that killed dozens of men. None described anything approaching 11 weeks without break. The storm had entered his dreams. He slept and heard wind. He woke and heard the same wind, identical in tone and intensity. Sometimes he could not distinguish sleep from waking. The boundary blurred. He checked his trap lines and wondered if he had already checked them, if this was memory or present action. He began speaking aloud to himself, narrating his actions to maintain clarity. Gripping the handle now, pulling the north line. First trap arriving empty. Second trap arriving. Rabbit inside. Processing the rabbit. The catches continued. The trap lines functioned with mechanical reliability. Animals needed food regardless of weather. They moved through their territories following instincts older than human civilization. They entered his traps. He processed them. The cycle continued. His food stores filled one entire corner of the cabin: smoked rabbit, preserved marmot, dried hare. Enough to survive another month if the storm lasted. Enough to survive 2 months if he rationed. He thought constantly about engineering principles. His father had taught him that good design anticipated failure modes. Every joint needed backup strength. Every system needed redundancy. Tobias had built 5 trap lines when 3 would have sufficed. He had built 84 traps when 50 might have worked. The redundancy was saving him now. If one line failed, the rope broke, the anchor pulled loose, the traps buried too deep for remained. If half his traps stopped catching, 40 still functioned. The mathematics of survival required margins. On day 56, During a trapline check, Tobias experienced complete whiteout conditions. Visibility dropped to 0. He could not see his own hands. He stood motionless, gripping the rope, and realized he could navigate by touch alone. The rope was his lifeline. Follow it outward. Count the traps. Follow it back. He completed the check without seeing anything. The system worked even in impossible conditions. For miles away, Martin Cole ate his last 6 beans on day 58. He chewed slowly, making them last. Afterward, he sat by his fire and calculated. He had perhaps 3 days before weakness prevented action. After that, he would die in his cabin. He tried not to think about his German neighbor. Tobias was certainly dead by now. Everyone was dead. The storm had killed the entire territory. Martin closed his eyes and waited. Day 77 marked a grim milestone. Tobias carved the 11th group of 7 lines on his cabin wall, showing 11 weeks, 77 days of continuous storm. He searched his memory for any historical account of weather lasting this long, but found nothing. Older trappers had told stories of brutal winters and extended storms, seasons that killed dozens of men. Yet none described anything approaching 11 weeks without a break in the weather. The storm had now invaded his dreams. When he slept, he heard the wind. When he woke, he heard the exact same wind, identical in tone and intensity. Sometimes, he couldn't tell sleep from waking. The boundary had completely blurred. He checked his trap lines, then wondered if he had already checked them, if this was simply a memory or the present reality. To maintain clarity, he began speaking aloud to himself, narrating his actions in real time. Gripping the handle now, pulling the north line. First trap arriving empty. Second trap arriving, a rabbit inside. Processing the rabbit. The catches continued, as if, by some predetermined process. The trap lines functioned with machine-like reliability. The animals needed food, no matter the weather. They moved through their hunting grounds, following deeply ingrained instincts as old as life itself. They walked right into his traps. He processed them, and the cycle continued. His food stores were now overflowing, filling an entire corner of the cabin with smoked rabbit, preserved marmot, and dried hare. He had enough to survive at least another month if the storm never stopped, and perhaps 2 months if he rationed carefully. He turned his thoughts to engineering principles. He remembered his father's lessons that good design anticipated the inevitable failure modes. Every joint needed a backup plan, and every system needed redundancy. In building 5 trap lines when 3 would have done, in constructing 84 traps when 50 might have sufficed, he built in the protection that was now saving him. If one line failed, if the rope broke, the anchor came loose, or the traps were buried too deep, 4 remained. If half his traps stopped catching, 40 still functioned. The cold mathematics of survival demanded margins. On day 82, Tobias pulled his east line and found something unusual. Trap 14 contained a fox. Foxes were rare in his catches, generally too clever and too cautious to fall prey to his traps. This fox, however, was desperately hungry. It had entered the trap and triggered the door. Tobias processed it carefully, realizing that although the fox fur was valuable, the fox's presence indicated something far more significant. Predators followed prey. If a fox was hunting so close to his cabin, then prey animals must be concentrated in the immediate area, proving that his trapline placement was, in fact, optimal. His thoughts often drifted to Martin Cole. For miles was nothing in normal conditions, but in this relentless storm, it might as well be 400. But there was nothing he could do to check on his neighbor without abandoning his own survival system. Walking 4 miles in whiteout conditions now almost certainly meant death. He would lose his way, exhaust himself, and freeze. Even if he somehow made it to Martin's cabin, he had no way of carrying the man back. So, the decision was brutally clear: stay alive himself or risk dying to check on someone who was probably already dead. Day 84 brought a subtle shift in the weather. The wind shifted slightly, coming from true north instead of northwest. After 84 days of virtually identical conditions, Tobias noticed the slightest variation immediately. Although he didn't know exactly what it meant, the change mattered. perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. All he could do was check his trap lines and wait. Then, day 91 arrived unlike all the rest. Tobias woke and heard silence. Not complete silence. The wind still blew, and snow still fell, but both were reduced, diminished. The constant roar that had filled his ears for the past 13 weeks had dropped to a murmur. He immediately got up and opened his cabin door. Visibility now stretched to 50 feet. He could see trees, individual trees, distinct and separate. The last time he saw them had been in November. The storm wasn't over, but it was breaking. Snow continued falling, but much lighter now. The wind came in sporadic gusts instead of the steady, relentless pressure of the past 3 months. The clouds showed more variation in density, including thin patches where gray sky became visible. Okay, here's the translated and rewritten text, aiming for a natural, evocative tone, as if a native speaker were telling the story. Almost bone-white. After a grueling 91 days, the most brutal blizzard in the recorded history of the Rocky Mountains finally started to loosen its icy grip. Tobias meticulously checked his trap lines. The routine stayed the same, no matter how much the weather improved. North line, 3 rabbits. Northeast line, 2 rabbits, 1 marmot. East line, 1 rabbit. Southeast line, empty. South line, 4 rabbits, 10 animals in total. He processed them with care, his hands moving through the familiar motions. Skinning, cleaning, preserving. The work kept him anchored, grounded. On day 94, the snow finally stopped altogether. Tobias stood outside his cabin, just staring at the still air. No snowflakes falling. The sky was still overcast, gray, and heavy, but nothing was coming down from it. After 3 solid months of constant snowfall, the stillness felt wrong, unnatural. He walked maybe 20 feet from his cabin, further than he'd gone since way back in November. The whole world had been transformed. Snow was piled up in drifts 8 to 10 feet deep. Trees were buried up to their lower branches. The landscape looked alien, completely unfamiliar. Day 96 brought a weak, watery sunlight. Tobias saw his shadow for the first time in what felt like forever, 13 weeks. The psychological impact was huge. He just stood there, motionless, watching his shadow on the snow, like he was confirming that he still existed, that he was a real, physical thing that could block light. The storm had shrunk his whole existence down to just sound, touch, and cold. His vision had been limited to the 10-foot radius of his cabin. Seeing distance again, seeing his shadow, it restored something essential, something vital. He decided to check on Martin Cole, who lived 4 miles east. The risk seemed okay now. He could see for about half a mile. He could use landmarks to navigate. He got ready carefully, packing rope, dried meat, medical supplies. If Martin was still alive, he'd need help. And if Martin was dead, Tobias needed to know that too. The trip took 3 solid hours. The snow depth made walking unbelievably exhausting. Every step, he'd break through the crust, sinking down to his waist, pulling himself out, and doing it all over again. For miles turned into a full-blown expedition. He finally found Martin's cabin by following the creek drainage. The cabin was almost completely buried. Snow was piled up against the walls, reaching all the way to the roof. But there was smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was alive inside. Tobias knocked. No answer. He pushed the door open. Martin Cole was sitting by the fire, just skin and bones, wrapped in blankets. He turned slowly and stared. Recognition dawned slowly. Tobias? His voice was weak, barely there. You're alive. Tobias stepped inside. Martin looked at him. Healthy, strong, well-fed, and understanding washed over his face. Your trap lines worked. Tobias just nodded. They worked. Martin Cole recovered slowly. Tobias brought him food every day for a week, smoked rabbit, preserved marmot, dried hare, stuff from his surplus stores. Martin ate just small portions at first, his stomach too messed up from starvation to handle normal amounts. He got stronger little by little. By the 2nd week, he could walk. By the 3rd, he could work. The first thing he asked was to see Tobias's trapline system. They stood outside Tobias's cabin in late February. The ground was still covered in 4 feet of snow, but the sun was shining. Tobias showed him how it worked. He gripped the wooden handle and pulled. The rope went taut. 16 wooden cages started sliding through the snow toward them, leaving parallel tracks. Martin watched without saying a word. 3 traps had rabbits in them. Tobias removed them, reset the triggers, and walked the line back out. The whole thing took maybe 30 minutes. Martin understood immediately. You never left sight of your cabin. Tobias nodded. Never needed to. Martin asked to learn everything. Tobias spent 3 days teaching him how to build the traps. They worked side by side, shaping wood, cutting slats, drilling holes for mortise and tenon joints. Martin's hands were clumsy at first, weak from starvation, but the muscle memory came back. Tobias explained the door mechanisms, the trigger plates, the balance points. He showed Martin how to treat the rope with bare fat, how to space the traps for the best coverage, how to position the lines to intersect game trails near shelter. Why didn't you tell anyone? Martin asked on the 4th day. Tobias thought about the question for a moment. I tried. Red. Murphy laughed. Frank Grayson called it a waste of time. You thought I was crazy. Martin nodded slowly. We were fools. Tobias shook his head. You followed methods that had worked for decades. The storm was unprecedented. Nobody could have predicted it. Word spread through the surviving trapping community. 5 trappers had made it through the blizzard. Martin Cole, who barely survived. Tobias Veer, who thrived. And 3 others who had been at Fort McKenzie when the storm hit and just never left the trading post. Red Murphy was dead, found frozen 2 miles from his cabin in April. Frank Grayson was dead, discovered in May, collapsed near his trap line. Peter Lundgren was dead, his body found half a mile from his cabin. 7 other trappers from outlying territories were presumed dead, their cabins abandoned or destroyed. Henry Blackwood documented the disaster in his trading post records. Winter of 1840 to 1841, 13-week blizzard, 12 confirmed deaths in northern Montana Territory. 1 survivor used connected trap line system designed for extreme weather operation. System kept operator within 160 feet of shelter while maintaining food supply. The notation was clinical, factual. It went into the official Hudson's Bay Company records. Thomas Rivera arrived from the Southern Territories in June. He was a Mexican trapper who had heard stories about the German who survived the impossible winter. Tobias showed him the system. Rivera studied it for 2 days, asked a ton of detailed questions, and built a prototype. He went back south with plans to put it in place before the next winter. By autumn of 1841, 7 trappers in the northern Rockies were building connected trap line systems. Tobias's innovation spread through practical demonstration, not through any kind of promotion. Tobias kept trapping until 1848, 7 more winters in the Montana high country, each one using his connected trap line system. None of those winters were as bad as the 13-week blizzard of 1840 to 1841, but a few came close. The winter of 1843 brought 9 weeks of nonstop snow. The winter of 1846 brought 11. Tobias survived both comfortably. Other trappers using his system survived as well. Those who went back to traditional methods faced the same old dangers. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed in the late 1840s. Beaver populations had been trapped almost to extinction in the accessible areas. And, even more importantly, European fashion changed. Silk replaced beaver felt in hat production. Demand for pelts disappeared practically overnight. Trappers found themselves with valuable skills in a market that just didn't exist anymore. Most moved on. Some went to California for the gold rush. Others headed to Oregon for farmland. A few stayed in the mountains, trapping just to survive, not for profit. Tobias left Montana in the spring of 1848. He was 39 years old and had saved enough money to start over. He traveled to Oregon Territory and bought a small ranch in the Willamette Valley. The land was fertile, the climate was mild compared to Montana winters. He built a cabin using the same careful joinery his father had taught him. He raised cattle, grew wheat, lived a quiet life. In 1851, he married a widow named Anna Kruger, who had immigrated from Prussia. They had 2 daughters. His family never knew the details of his trapping years. He didn't talk about the blizzard or the men who died or the system that saved him. But in the mountains, the knowledge lived on. Martin Cole taught the connected trap line technique to 6 other trappers before moving to California in 1852. Those 6 taught others. The system spread north into Canada, where Hudson's Bay Company factors documented it in their operational manuals. It spread west into Idaho and Wyoming territories. It spread east into the Dakotas. Variations developed based on local conditions and available materials, but the core principles stayed the same. Keep the traps close to shelter, connect them for single-point retrieval, and use live capture boxes for extended holding. Fort Mackenzie's records from 1842 through 1865 contain references to Verern-style trap lines or connected cage systems in reports of trapper survival during severe weather. Company estimates suggested the technique saved 30 to 50 lives over 2 decades by allowing trappers to maintain food supplies during extended storms that made traditional trap line travel impossible. The exact number was impossible to know. Survival often went unrecorded, but the pattern was clear. Trappers using connected systems near their shelters survived storms that killed those using traditional, distant trap lines. Tobias Vierer died in 1873 at age 64. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone listed his name, birth year, death year, and nothing else. His daughters inherited the ranch. His grandchildren never learned he had been a trapper. But in the mountains of Montana, Wyoming, and Canada, rotted rope lines were still visible in the dirt near abandoned cabins, marking places where wooden cages once stood, where innovation had quietly changed what it meant to survive.